Okay, so this is a recording post class because I unfortunately was not able to record during the class um, because the broadcast was actually not started. So that's on me, but I'll just go over everything again. It might be actually a little bit quicker since we're not going to stop for the exercises. I'll try to show the exercises submissions so I can explain some of the corrections that I made. And of course, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach me through Slack. So we're going to go and go ahead and go through the slides for web forms. So web forms have been around for a very long time on websites. And in fact, is one of the ways that we interact with servers. We put in information on forms, and that's how we send data back to the servers. And so we're just going to go over some of the basics and different types that exist. So forms help us gather information from a user. Just think of it as if you went through the Ruby class. During that class, we had the method gets, which it allowed us to get some input during the course of a script. Well, for websites, we have a form that is displayed on the website where you can literally type in any string or do any input. So like other elements, other HTML elements, we have a form element. And as you can see here, it's just defined by the word form. And in this particular example, we have the form with two attributes. First attribute is the action attribute, and the second attribute is the method attribute. Now the action tells the form where to submit the information. So it's more of a location really than a verb, right? It can be a little misleading because it's called action, but this is where it's going to end up on the server. It's essentially saying, okay, this form is going to go to the login action and it's going to do it through a post method. We'll get into details to what that means later on. Now the input element can be of different types. Just think of it as it can take different shapes and behaviors, but it's always the same concept of I'm taking information from the user, and it can be in many different ways. So many examples are text, then we have hidden input, radio input, checkbox input, password input, and so on. So a very common one is the input of the type text. So you see it defined right here. That's what makes this input element behave as a text input. Now we're just going to call a username just to denote the fact that like whatever the user puts in this field, it will be a username, or it's meant to be a username. So I'm going to try it live so that we can see it at work. And in fact, I'm going to wrap it inside of a form element. So everything, all of your input elements are going to go inside of the form element. So let's try it. So I'm going to start from scratch. And in fact, to keep things clear, I'm going to rename this form. Gonna delete that. And as like I showed in the previous class, we can do preview and then live preview so that we can see the changes immediately, like this. So let's start with a regular HTML structure. We have the type of HTML, the type of document, which is HTML. We have the HTML tags that wraps everything. And we need a head element, and then we need the body element. So this is your headers, and this is what's going to be displayed in your website. So we can do title. And if we're going to do some styling later, then I'm going to do the style tag just to have it available in case I want to make things look different. So we got that out of the way. I'm going to fold this so that it's not distracting, and we're going to focus on the body element. And so we were talking about the form element. Let's do that right now. So Cloud9 automatically auto-completed 2 inputs for me. I'm not gonna go over the submit one yet, so I just deleted it just now. And so it automatically said, oh, you want a form. It most likely it's going to have an input, so I'm going to add one for you just as a template. And that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for an input of the type text. Let's give it a name, username. And you can see it here. It just created a box. Okay. So that's what we have right now. We have an input text with a name, username inside of a form element. I'm going to add the attributes that it will need later, which is action, where it's going to go, and then method. In this case, we can do post for now. Now there are other types of input. We have one called email. And I'm going to do it as I explain it so that you can see what I'm talking about. So let's do another one, input. And I'm going to change this type to email. And let's do email for the name. And as you can see, it looks identical. There's no visual difference between the two. However, what that does is it tells the browser, okay, I need an email here. And as you can see, when I click on it, it immediately tries to autocomplete an email. Whereas for the text, nothing happens, right? Like it's just like, oh, I'm going to give you everything that you might need to autocomplete. Similarly, if you were to access this website on your phone for the email type, it would give you more convenience, right? Because on the keyboard, it would show you the @ sign more available at the first screen. It also would give you suggestions such as .com or .org. Whereas if it was just text like this one, it just gives you the standard keyboard that you would get as if you were texting somebody. So it still would work. It's just, it's more clunky, then if you know you're getting an email, you can just do the type, and it will make it easier for everybody involved. So the same dynamic here for password. We all know that when we're typing passwords, we don't want that to show on the screen in case somebody's looking over your shoulder. So let's try that. I literally just copied this one and pasted it in, but I have to make sure I'm changing the attributes, because otherwise it would act the same, and I don't want that. I want it to act slightly different. So just so I can make it clear here, I'm gonna add labels inline like this. And let's just make it more visual friendly. Okay. So we have email that tries to autocomplete the email, and now we have password, with the biggest difference being that if I just type anything, it will just not show. It will do a dot instead. So the browser knows, okay, you gave me a type input password, then I'm going to hide anything that I type in there. Now we have another type of input, which is called the radio button. So far, all the inputs have looked like fields, right, on a form that you can type on. They behave differently, but they're meant for strings to be added onto. For a radio button, it's a little circle that you can check. I think it would be easier if we see it happen live. So I'm just going to copy this example and paste it here. We add another break just for visual sake. And indent it appropriately. So you want to keep things that are siblings on the same indentation. So these three elements are siblings to each other. So once I added those three, it's going to allow me to just check one. And it's very important to understand that the reason the browser knows to toggle between them is because they share the same name. See, they're all named day. Now, if I, for some reason, decide that to do something like this, where it's just two different ones, now the browser will not know that they are related to each other, and it's gonna do this. It's gonna let you check all three, and that's not how radio buttons are supposed to work. They're just supposed to work one at a time. So you want to make sure that your name matches so that it works as expected. Now we see that there's another attribute called value that is not present on the previous ones, right? All of a sudden we have a third one, whereas this one just has type and name. The reason being is because we still need to send something to the server. Like we can't just check something and then the form is not going to know, right? Because we're not typing anything, so it's just not going to know what is being checked. So it essentially means that once I check, for example, Friday, then this value is going to be sent back. So these two things serve two different purposes. This Friday right here is just simply something that's going to be displayed on the screen. Sorry. Display. See how it changes over here. Whereas the value could be anything that the server understands. So it could be a number, but it can be also the same thing. It's just that we have to understand that one is going to the server when the user checks something, and this is just something to display what it means. Now we just saw that radio buttons only work one at a time. We also need, sometimes there are scenarios when we need to check things that have different attributes, so we want to do multiple check. And that's when the checkbox input comes into play. So we still have three attributes, but in this case, the only thing that changes is the type. So let's just do that. So I'm just going to change that here, here, and here. And now we can see that even though they share the same name, the browser will allow all of them to be checked or just one, depending on what the user does. Now we have a text area element. And in this case, we just need one attribute that gives it a name. And it's sort of like, it's very similar to an input text field. The only difference is that for these fields, we just want maybe a name or an email or password or something that is maybe a couple of words. But what if you want to add a comment, right? Or if you want to add a note somewhere or description, all of a sudden you need more lines. It becomes a little awkward to say this is a comment and it will just keep going, right? So for that, we can use a text area like this. So it's actually an HTML element. So let's do it. And separate these so it's easier to read. So this is one way to do it. This is one way to do it. But we're actually going to do the element, which is like this. And now we see a big difference between the two, right? Which is like bigger field, and now you can like expand it with your mouse. So let's make sure it has a name. And let's make it a comment for now. Okay, so Now we have a different way that we can select data. This is sort of like it's a drop-down list, so it's sort of like checkboxes, but in a scrolling form. And so this is a new element called a select. So think drop-down, think select. When I have something that I want to select, that's what we do in a drop-down. So I'm going to have that element. Now, as you can see, we have 3 option elements inside of a select element. So in this example, we have a total of 4 elements. You always want to count elements by the open and closing tags. So this open select tag is closed by another closing select tag. So this is 1. This is 2. This is 3. And this is 4. 4 elements total. Let's try that out. Let me indent it. And now we see, for now I'm just adding this BR that I keep adding. It's just a break. Typically you would see that being done through CSS most of the time. But for the time being, I'm just using the break tag just to keep things more clear on this side. So just know that when you see that, that's all that's happening. I'm just making sure that they're going down instead of like it being side to side. So going back to the select element, the browser automatically knows, okay, you want to drop down, I'll create it. And because you told me to add 3 elements inside, that's what I'm going to do. And let's remember the same dynamic, right? What's inside of the tags is what's going to get displayed, and the value is what's going to get sent back to the server. So if I were to delete 2 options right here, then all of a sudden I just have 1 option on the drop down. So let's put them back, and they're back. And similarly, like if I, for some reason, do not add the label, it's still there. It's just not displaying anything. But if the user were to check it, it will still send that value. So always got to be careful to make sure that both of those items are there. Submit element is the final one, which is the one that kind of ties everything together. And I've been talking about sending, and so, well, you can't just type or you can just click and then it'd be over, right? We need something that sends all of that information, and that's why we need the submit element. So let's try it out. So you want to make sure that we're inside of the form. So as you can see, here's the opening tag of the form. Here's the closing tag. We're clearly inside. You do not want to do this. You do not want to put be outside, because all of a sudden it just doesn't make sense to the submit button what to do. So you want to be inside, and everything that is going on here is wrapped together. In fact, you can see it right now. Have the cursor on the form tag, and we can see on Cloud9 has a very convenient way of displaying, oh yeah, all of this is packed together. So if this submit, I'm going to assume it's going to be for all this. Now, something that is important to know is that value here is not what's going to get sent back, but it's what's being displayed, which is a little bit of a quirk, right? That's not how the other ones are behaving. So that's something important to know. So we can style forms just like any other element. Let's remember that's what they are. They are HTML elements, and HTML elements can be styled. So there's nothing special about them in terms of styling. During the class, I raised the question, what do we think is happening here? And, just looking at this, not thinking about forms or anything at all, we can translate this in our minds to just read this way. My selector, which is the thing I am targeting, is the input HTML element. How do we know it's an element? Because there's no dot sign, or I'm sorry, there's no period or there's no pound sign before it. If it had a period, it would be a class, and if it was a pound, it would be an ID. But because it's just a word, then it's an HTML element. And so that means I'm saying anytime I see an input element in my HTML document, I am going to apply these two rules to it. Let's see. I'm going to go here, and just for the purposes of this classes, we're going to do it in the inside of a style tag in the head element. So I'm just going to paste and just indent things for readability. And a little bit of space so it's a little bit cleaner. And let's see, all of the inputs were affected. There were some that did not get affected, right? But that's because they do not know how to apply these rules to themselves. Doesn't mean it's not trying to, it is. It's just that it doesn't know how to do it. So that's why it's ignored. But you have to keep in mind that it is trying to target everything that is of an input element. And in fact, for this one, it's not, because it is actually not an input element. It's a text area element. But for this, it just doesn't know how to do that to itself. So we see that the color is kind of like a green color. So it's going to happen for the text that I type in here. So this is the section where we do a form exercise. You're going to build an app that sells ice cream. You want to ask the user for the basics, first, last name, and email. You want them to select what flavors of ice cream they want to order. So use a checkbox for that. If a user wants to order multiple flavors, they can. You also want to know what method of payment they will be using. So for that, it's just one payment method. So you want to use a radio button. And you can style the form with CSS for extra credit. Since this is after class, you can pause the video and do this exercise, as I will go into the answers immediately after. So go ahead and pause the video, work on the exercise, and see you on the other side. Okay, so I'm going to go through a couple of answers just to kind of see what they look like, you're gonna find that there's no real, like, it's not gonna be as much consistency as, say, when we solve Ruby problems, because you can approach HTML in so many different ways, depending on how you want it to look. So let's see if we can look at a bare bones one where you just have the fields. Let's try this one. Okay. So very simple, very efficient. And let's parse it out to see what's happening. So something I like to do sometimes is just fold things to make things clearer. And so we have the document, we have the head, and we have the body where everything's going on. And then we have a form, right? See, it's wrapping everything. And inside of it, we're going to see all of the inputs. So we have 3 inputs right here. We have 2 text and 1 that is expecting email. So this works, but it's preferable to have email here, since we know that that's what it's meant for. And so now the browser knows to fill in email. Then we have the checkbox, so we can choose multiple options. And finally, we have 3 radios, and they all say payment. So I'm expecting this to work, and it does. This is for any notes regarding your order. Okay. And finally, the submit button, which is styled with the same example, it looks like, from the previous slide. So let's do something crazy to display what's happening. Yeah, so that just adds a really fat border to each input. And let's change the color. I don't know if this will work. Let's see. No, it doesn't. Let's try red. Okay, so yeah, that did work. In between your CSS rules, it's good to keep a space. So you have one rule right here, and then you have another rule here. Just makes it a little bit more readable. You want your closing bracket to be at the same level as the beginning, like that. See how they're the same. And then you want your rules to be one tab indented, I'm sorry. Okay, let's look at another one just to see differences. So let's try this one real quick. So this one does not have style, so that's okay. It just something to note so that we can tell why nothing is showing up in terms of style. But I do want to go over the first 3 fields. So we have first name, but it's also like I can go on about my life, right? Here. So that's not optimal. It will still send the information, but doesn't really reflect what we're like expecting. So a better choice probably would have been an input of type text. And we have first name for the input. And now we can do the label. And we're going to get rid of that element. And so that makes a little bit more sense. Than having a text area. So you would have to change each one here. But I just wanted to point this out just to show that like the type will make a difference in the way that it conveys the intent to the user what the field is for. So everything else looks good. Yeah. Cool. So we're going to talk a little bit about a GET request or methods in general, request methods. So the reason that this one is a GET request is because the attribute on the element is called GET. And so we're going to try that on our example. So here's our form. Right now our action is empty. So the slide is asking us to keep it empty and changes to GET. So now this whole form is a GET form. And let's try it. I'm going to try it on a different window like that. Oh, that's not the one, sorry. This is the form that we're dealing with. Yeah, this is the form right here. So let's try that again. Now, I hit submit, and this is what happened, right? We have this very long string of things. And this is what's called the query string. Now, you can see that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Sorry. Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pairs. So let's see if that matches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, what that does is it just appends everything in the form to the URL after the question mark. So let's see. It tries to build this URL format, which means you have your domain, which is your root website. So I'm going to take it off so that we can see it happen in real time. So this is your domain. It's what you would call your website. So if you went to Google, then that's your domain. There's nothing here. Then you have a path. Continuing with Google, so let's see. Warriors, I like the Warriors. So now we have a search path that got added. And then finally we have a query string. How do I know that the path ended here? Because of this question mark. Anything after this question mark is a query string, and it can be very long, as you can see here. It depends on what the website is doing with the form. So let's go back to our simple example. I'm going to fill things out just so that it makes a little bit more sense. Now, as you can see, the query string got populated on the URL after the question mark, and now we have key value pairs, right? What that means is that I have one pair, which is key value. I have another pair, sorry, up until here. Oop, that made a jump. That was not clear. But from email to gmail.com, that's another pair. Then we have the password, and so on. So you see that there's a pattern there. Every time you see an ampersand, that's sort of like what we would think would be a comma on an array. You just separating each value pair. Now the form can be submitted using other methods, also called verbs. You have get, you have post, you have put, and you have delete. There's many others out there, but these are very common, so you're going to see them all the time. So where would this go on a form? Well, that's the method. That would be here. So this is what you would be changing the attribute on the form. It would be delete. It would be post, get, put, and so on. When you select a post method, the information is not passed on the URL. So if we did post here, I'm gonna refresh that and refresh this one. It should not say see. There we go. It did not, as you can see, it did not add anything to the URL. And for the purposes of this class, you can ignore this for now because we don't have a server available. So it didn't know where to send it. That's why we were getting that error. But the point of it is that it takes this information and tries to send it on behind the scenes, so that sensitive information doesn't get displayed on the URL. Same thing with the put method, but instead of, like, say, creating a comment here with the post method, what you would be doing is maybe updating that comment or replacing it with a different comment. So that's what put is used for. It's like updating or replacing. Finally, delete behaves similar like get, where you get the information in the URL, but it is used to communicate the intention of deleting something. It's good to memorize a lot of these HTML elements. We're talking about paragraphs, headings, even the structure of a HTML page. But important also is forms, as they allow interaction between the user and the website. So just knowing how forms work in general, and it's good to memorize and be able to know how we can target those elements and apply style rules to them is also good. So this website it's good. It contains cheat sheets that you can refer to. Sorry about that. So here we go. In general, you can just go to Google, and typically you can do things like Ruby cheat sheet or CSS cheat sheet. It's a very common thing to do, and don't be afraid of going back and using it as a reference. But also be mindful to understand the underlying functionality of things, and so that way you may not have to rely on memory that much after a while, just because you know how it works or how it's supposed to be a structure. So this is the close-in exercise for the class. I'm going to also review a couple of examples. So you may pause the video and we can take a look at a couple of examples after that. Okay, so the exercise is you are creating an app to list houses for sale. You must have essentially several inputs, one for address, one for city, one for state, one for the number of square feet, one for the number of rooms, and you want to use the radio input for single family versus multifamily, checkboxes for fireplace, basement, garage, and you want to select on the drop down a year when it was built. Now, for the purposes of speed, you just want to do from 2010 to 2018. And finally, a description. So let's take a look at a couple submissions. I'm literally just copying and pasting what the submission was. And then we can take a look. This looks good. First thing that we can see is that there were some styles applied. And in this case, we're targeting the body element. And because we're targeting that body element, then it's the thing that contains everything. So if we give it a background color, then it's going to apply that to everything in the background. Similarly, that's why everything is centered. So let's test that theory. Yep. So I just commented that rule out and put everything to the left, but that rule is applying the center for the body. And so we have an address input, we have a city input, state, square foot, and number of rooms. One thing to note is that whoever submitted this knew that of the placeholder attribute. And what this does is it allows that legend that you see there on that field, right? Like I'm gonna demonstrate what happens if I take it off. Sorry. See, it went away. It still works as an input, but there's no hint as to what's going on. So, if you want to avoid having to label your field like this, and a placeholder is a good alternative, because we're used to seeing that. We're used to seeing a placeholder and knowing that if I go in there, it will just take over with whatever I put in. I'm gonna make this a little bit more readable. Okay. Now we have the radio buttons that let me select either single family or multifamily. Again, it works because the name matches. And same thing here. It's a good use of checkboxes. And finally, we have all the options inside of select element. So because I have a select element, let me fold this for a second. Then what this represents is all of this. As you see how the Cloud9 highlights it. And then each option is inside of that element, so we can see it happen here. Now this value, it looks different from what's displayed, and this is just a choice of whoever submitted this exercise. It could be anything, but it's important to remember that the value is what's going to get sent back to the server. This is just this section right here is just what's displayed here. So let's demonstrate that. Yeah, but the value 11 is still going to get sent back to the server. Another look at another one. Cool. So this one has a lot of filing. Looks nice. And we can see that there's a lot of rules applied to everything in the body. And that's why we have a nice border around everything. And then the enforcing of the background color is white, but it could easily be pink or something else. Now, this one is targeting the ID form. So let's remember that with ID form, you only want to see it one time. So this is outside of how it's supposed to be. You can tell that it's showing up several times. So you want to avoid that. Most likely what was meant was a class. So, for example, we have here an element that has two attributes, one ID and one class. Well, what you can do is add the form class, and now you don't need the ID anymore because classes are meant to be reused. So let's go real quick through all of that and just clean that up for a second. See, I'm just adding it every time there's a class. I'm just adding that form class, converting it over to a class instead of it being an ID. You want the ID to be only happening one time. But if this is happening several times, we can do something different. So I changed things on the HTML, and because I did that, all the styles went away, right? That it makes sense that it would go away because the styles are looking for an ID form. Well, let's correct that and just change this to a dot, and all of a sudden we're back. We're back to square one. But now with the implementation of this is a class, and because it's a class, I expected to see it many times over and over. So that's the only thing that it looks like needed some tweaking. And everything else looks good. Maybe you probably need a text area on this input. So let's see if we can find it. Okay, so I believe that should work, but maybe it won't. No, it won't. So what you want for text area is an actual element. So it's not really input anymore. It's text area element. Doesn't need a type because the element itself knows how to behave. And this is happening because I need to close it since it's an element. So yep. Okay. So now we can add more details if I wanted to. Okay, so that concludes the lesson. I hope that covered everything in regards to different types of forms, at least the basics. Obviously, things can get more complex as your forms evolve, but that is the backbone of every website's input. Like if you dig down, deep down enough on any website that you go to, at the end of the day, you're going to find a form and an input field. So this just gives you a base to understand how things move from the user into the website and towards the server. So yeah, if you have any more questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me through Slack. See you then.